Hey there, good evening everyone. This is Dr. Karen Sullivan coming at you with another Eye Care for Your Brain free Wednesday health lecture. I lovingly offer you this information in order for you to feel more empowered and more validated by things that all too often do not trickle down to you as the person who is living through the brain health challenge. Tonight we are going to talk about my favorite part of the brain, the cerebellum. This is a very poorly understood part of the brain clinically. Researchers are very aware of the last 25 years worth of research that has helped us understand that the cerebellum is so much more than how it gets stereotyped. If you go to your typical physician, sometimes even your typical neurologist, they are still believing the old school belief that this is only the motor coordination center of the brain, that this is only the balance center of the brain. Well, we know a lot more in the last 25 years that really the cerebellum is kind of the powerhouse of the brain. And what I wanted to do tonight was share some recent research with you. To make that recent research make sense, though, I want us to go back a little bit and just build a nice foundation about what exactly is going on with the cerebellum. Really quite a fascinating part of the brain. So we have this little tiny organ back here. We think of, this part, when you think of your brain, you're really kind of thinking of what we call the neocortex and the subcortical section. So all that is kind of the bumpy green, pardon me, not green, oh my gosh, I've had a long day, gray, sulci and gyri, all of those bumps and grooves. That's the outside of the brain, that's the gray matter. And then inside we have the white matter and all of the different structures that are kind of like the motors or the powerhouses of the brain. And behind that, kind of tucked up right underneath the brainstem, is the cerebellum. But the cerebellum is very interesting for a few reasons. But one is it's actually shaped and kind of designed physiologically in a very similar way to that neocortex, the brain that you think of when you think of the brain. It's got two hemispheres. It's got a little strip of nerve cells right down the middle that connect both of the hemispheres called the vermis. In the rest of the brain, that's called the corpus callosum, that goes right down the middle. And that really integrates information across the hemispheres and lets them talk rapidly. And so what I think is so important about talking about this is that if you are living with a brain health challenge that involves the cerebellum and you don't educate yourself about all the other functions of the cerebellum, you're not going to be validated about what you're living with. And that is very important to me because I think when we don't understand what's going on with our brain injury or our brain health condition, it's all too often to have that increased anxiety, feel like you're wondering if you're losing your mind, are you, starting to go crazy, and you can't learn about it so it makes more sense to you. I just feel so strongly that education is a huge part of what we need to do better with as brain health educators. So if you get yourself to a good neurologist and you've had a cerebellar injury or a disorder that affects the cerebellum, maybe they help you understand that it is also involved with emotional regulation, finding your words, your eye movements. But all too often what I'm finding is that that information does not trickle down. So it's very important that I teach you here in my way about all that the cerebellum does. So the first thing I want you to understand is the cerebellum is different from the rest of the brain because it operates in an ipsilateral way for movement. And what I mean by that is the left side of the cerebellum controls the left side of the body, and the right side of the cerebellum controls the right side of the body. This is totally different than in the cortex where things are crossed, right? So if you've had a left-sided stroke, you're going to have some motor issues, might not be able to use your right arm, damage in the right hemisphere, same thing on the left arm. So the cerebellum is already different because it doesn't do that. It kind of sticks with its own in terms of moving our limbs. Well, about 30 years ago, the cerebellum finally got a ticket to the brain health party, and the relationship between higher cognitive function and emotion and the cerebellum really started to grow, and people started to understand it from a research perspective. And this was mostly due to technological advances and things like fMRI, where we can actually visualize the brain doing tasks. And a lot of this information comes out of Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, my second hometown. So the way I want to teach you how to think about the cerebellum is, yes, indeed, it does all that motor stuff. It is the balance center of the brain, but it's also the great coordinator of all things, including your thoughts, your recall, your emotions, okay? So this may be relevant to you if you've had a vertebral artery stroke. if you have essential tremor, if you have orthostatic tremor, if you have sustained damage to your brain because of drinking too much alcohol, okay? So it's very important that you learn about this stuff, like I said, to make sense of what it exactly is that you're living with. So second thing I want you to know about the cerebellum is it is fast, 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 fast. It works extremely fast. That actually is a sneak preview on the research update I'm going to share with you in a little bit. Again, historically, this has only been thought of in terms of, reflexes, balance, equilibrium, muscle tone. When the cerebellum is damaged, we're going to see cognitive and emotional symptoms, okay? I've said this before. You can really think of the brain as working in triplicate in really 3 different planes: physical, cognitive, and emotional. We could probably add sensory in there too, but we'll just go with the 3: physical, cognitive, and emotional. And a lot of times the way we understand the brain works is that what you see physically manifests itself emotionally, manifests itself cognitively, and the cerebellum is no different. So if we know that the cerebellum makes it difficult for us to have smooth, coordinated movements, let's say of our arm, guess what? It's also going to likely result in people having difficulty managing their emotions, right? Emotional magnitude. When something is maybe not so stressful, people with cerebellar issues can make it feels very, very intense. Can also be the opposite. Something really stressful happens, and sometimes folks with cerebellar stuff, it's like they're flat, they're kind of blunted, they don't really get it, they don't really feel it. So what I want to do is talk to you about direct damage to the cerebellum and indirect damage. So direct damage, this is symptoms that come directly from disruption of the cerebellum. And indirect results are symptoms that you have from damage to the cerebellum because it takes other parts of the brain offline. The brain is connected in a mega series of interconnecting circuits, and all sorts of things that we do are very widely distributed throughout our brain. Very few things are just focused in one part of the brain. Word finding is probably one of those, but many things, like even how we represent our interests and our relationships, these things are all over our brains in big old circuits, right? Because we do complicated things. We need complicated, wiring to figure out all the things that we need to do. So sometimes you can have a cerebellar issue, but you might actually have a frontal lobe impairment because it disrupts the connections between those 2 parts of the brain. Super interesting. So let's just go back to the direct damage, and you can think of this as happening through the acronym of DANISH, D-A-N-I-S-H. The first one is a very long word that I don't even really know how to pronounce this word, but basically it's dysdiadochokinesia. And what that means is it's just trouble in carrying out rapid alternate movements. So you might know when you go to the neurologist, they might have you do this. Sometimes they have us do this. Okay, all sorts of quick movements. Sometimes right on the thighs, they might ask you to just put your hands up and down 2 different directions. Next one is ataxia. Cerebellar damage is most often associated with ataxia. Ataxia is a funny word in brain science because it's an umbrella term. It doesn't actually mean one thing. It can mean a couple different things, but mostly you can think about it like it's trouble with coordination. And a lot of ataxic symptoms mimic when someone is intoxicated, and that's why it can be very hard to live with ataxia because people might think you've been drinking. So things like slurred speech, stumbling, falling, incoordination, it can affect your limbs, it can affect kind of your center, your trunk. The next one, N, in the Danish acronym is nystagmus. And so this is rhythmic, abnormal eye movements with a slow eye movement kind of dragging over here. And then when it goes to catch up, it's not what we call a smooth pursuit. It's kind of sticky. It's like, And this can happen either horizontally, this can happen vertically, it can happen going up at a diagonal, or a combination of all these things. The next one, the I in Danish, is intention tremor. This is also known as a cerebellar tremor. This is characterized by a very low frequency, below 5 hertz tremor. And the idea is the amplitude of the tremor, the shakiness of it, gets worse as you get closer to your intention, to your goal. So a very easy way to test this for yourself is to put your arms out in front of you and to very slowly bring your finger up to your nose. And what you will find with an intention tremor from the cerebellum is you can do pretty darn good right up until you get to the nose. And if someone's watching, they can see you can get just a little shakier as it goes there. That also gets tough though when you go to write, because you're doing that same kind of fine-grained coordination. The next one, the S in Danish, is scanning speech. So this is speech ataxia, and this is when we have a certain kind of a dysarthria, so trouble getting the words out, and it's as if spoken words are broken up by syllable. It's very staccato, often separated by a noticeable pause, and sometimes the breathing that goes along with scanning speech is very breathy. It's like hard to control. Sometimes it's a lot of air, other times it can be kind of low. It's just kind of all over the place. There's not a flow or an ease to the tone or the speech that comes out. The H is hypotonia. This is disequilibrium. So this is a loss of stability in walking. And you don't notice it very much because the brain is so smart and it compensates. So what you notice more is the compensation. And this is the wide-based gait that we see in cerebellar issues. And you might not even notice it. This is why neurologists have you, in part, walk up and down the hallway, because they want to see, are your feet further apart than is normal, okay? So you can have someone take a look at you and you can see, wow, are my feet a little bit more spread apart? And that's the idea, is that you're actually giving yourself a compensatory strategy for managing imbalance. I think that's pretty cool. And the H in Danish is hypotonia. This is the medical phrase for decreased muscle tone. Healthy muscles are never fully relaxed, okay? When there is damage in the cerebellum, this is where we can get a lot of tension or stiffness, high muscle tone, okay? And this can be felt like a resistance to movement. So if someone has a lot of hypotonia and you try to open up their fingers, it's like very, very, very difficult. The cognitive impacts of direct damage to the cerebellum are going to be reduced processing speed, just a little slower, taking it all in and processing it. But probably the biggest impact is in speech because of all the fine coordination of the mouth muscles and the respiratory system that has to happen. For many of you, your speech in everyday ideal life is fine, but you can notice this speech issue when you get tired, if you get stressed, if there's a lot of distractions and you feel overwhelmed, okay? So that's the direct damage stuff. The indirect damage is what I find not a lot of people know about, and I feel like I've probably had my most satisfying feedbacks with people as a neuropsychologist when I help them understand this, because it's like, oh my gosh, that's a part of this? Like, no one ever helped me understand that. So if when I tell you this, you're like, holy crap, this makes me feel so much better because at least I understand, that's yet another reason I would love for you to see a board certified neuropsychologist, because we're the doctors that know this stuff and we care about how it affects you. So remember before I said the motor functions of the cerebellum are same, right? Ipsilateral, left cerebellum controls left side, right cerebellum controls right side. Well, it gets much more complicated with the emotions and cognition, because now they start to become crossed or they are mixed, so same or crossed. So I can help you understand this pretty easy if I explain to you that the left cerebellum is connected to the right frontal lobe and the right cerebellum is connected to the left frontal lobe. So even though your left frontal lobe may be perfectly healthy and functional, there are some cognitive and emotional functions that will be disrupted because it's not getting the same input. Its relationship to the cerebellum has been broken or changed, okay? So the big one is if you have a right cerebellar issue, you are going to have word finding difficulty, okay? And I'm going to go into the emotional stuff later. If you have a left cerebellar issue, your right frontal lobe is not going to be as functional as it once was. And what we do with our right frontal lobe is things like put the brakes on being impulsive, saying things that maybe aren't the right timing or maybe are said a little more gruffly than we would really appreciate, okay? Our executive functions, so our organization and our planning, that appears to be mixed, and that's really interesting because that gets really complicated with different circuits. When we think of the cerebellum and emotion, we used to only think of a part of the brain called the limbic system being relevant to the brain, right, and mental health. But really, the cerebellum is so involved with emotions that they now actually call the middle part of the cerebellum the limbic cerebellum. So limbic system typically refers to the neurologically hardwired for emotion, right? Things like your amygdala, things that make you feel very anxious or very fearful. Well, now we know the cerebellum has a lot to do with processing emotions, okay? I'm actually gonna show you here. This is the magic behind the scene. Oh boy, I hope you can see that. Okay, What I want you to see here, these are two pictures of a cerebellum. This is kind of a neuroanatomical picture, so you can kind of get a sense of there's two hemispheres and there's like a middle, like a little caterpillar there in the middle. And there's, I think there's 10 layers going up and down, and they all do different things. What I want you to notice is this one, okay? So here's a cerebellum, and the yellow dots there are meaning that part of the brain controls motor function. So remember I said before, that's totally true that the cerebellum is very involved with motor function and balance. But look at my blue dots. That is where we know that there are cognitive or emotional circuits. There's more blue dots than there are yellow dots in this brain. So what does that tell us? That tells us that a whole lot of emotional things are happening in this brain. So the main circuits or loops that the cerebellum has is with the prefrontal cortexes, okay, our limbic system, and our parietal lobes, which is involved with our spatial processing, okay? So we call all of these non-motor functions when we talk about cognition. And the big one that we're gonna see is with word finding, with speech timing, that's kind of that dysarthria, kind of getting it out in kind of a fluent, perfectly timed way. Handwriting, verbal working memory. So what I mean by that is like being able to remember what you need to go to the grocery store, or if you're on the internet and you look up a phone number, not having to write it down, you typically replay it in your mind over and over again. Those are the things that are really impaired when you have a cerebellar issue, okay? When there is increasing demand in your environment, like the need to do something fast, feeling like someone's watching you, feeling like you're overwhelmed, the cerebellum is going to get strained, okay? Strained, and all your symptoms are gonna get worse. And that's what I worry about. If you don't understand that this is par for the course, if you have a cerebellar issue, you're gonna get stressed out when it happens, because now you might think you're having another brain health issue, okay? And really to suss that out, you need a me in your life. You need a neuropsychologist to meet with you and to get to know you and to do your testing for you. And as you guys know, I always promise to hook you up with the best person that I know in your area. If you want to send us a zip code, we're happy to do that. So let's talk about the indirect impact of cerebellar issues on emotions, okay? The cerebellum is part of the emotional network in the brain, okay? And this involves the perception of your emotions, other people's emotions, the recognition of emotions within your own mind, how you evaluate your emotions, but really what I see in my practice is emotional regulation, okay? Really being able to take something in and then have an emotional expression that is, I hate to say this word, but is appropriate, okay? What we see, because either the left frontal lobe or the right frontal lobe is having some indirect poor input, I often see that there is kind of a brake or a gas issue. So what I mean by that, and I use that analogy all the time for the brain because it's so apt, is that we either get too much gas, which is impulsivity, saying things we know we shouldn't say, regretting it, feeling like crap because we did it, or too much brake, which is not really having an emotional reaction, being kind of too mellow, right? Too calm, like someone died, you should have a feeling about that. Cerebellar issues can sometimes make you just feel like you're kind of numb, okay? And that can happen for a lot of other reasons. You know, we talk a lot on here about post-traumatic stress disorder as it relates to brain health issues. And, you know, again, that's why you need an individual assessment. The main chemicals in the brain and really what their job is inhibition, which means stopping. So more often than not, what you see with cerebellar stuff is trouble stopping, right? Putting the brakes, you know, knowing what you know. And this is where like pausing and not overreacting comes in. So all of that was just to set you up for this new research on the cerebellum that I promised you, okay? So, but if I didn't tell you that, you wouldn't really know how to make sense of this, I think. So this is what's super cool. So remember before I said the cerebellum is very much like what you think of as the regular brain, right? And in part, that's because they each have a cortex, and that's the gray matter. And that's the gray, not the green, bumpy, kind of wet stuff that you think of when you think of a brain, okay? So the reason that we have those things called gyri and sulci are to fit more information into the brain matter, right? If we didn't have a brain that was all folded up, our head would be something like 4 feet long, right? Because we would need all of that brain space. And so the brain and evolution being incredibly smart, they figured out a way to tightly pack it and to fold it in and go down. So not only do you have surface area, but now you can actually have brain cells all within the little divots and the dips, okay? So What these really smart people did at the University of London, and I think the University of, where is this one? Somewhere in Indiana, I want to say, is they got a really fancy MRI machine. Okay, they scanned people, and basically they folded and unstretched the cerebellum to actually lay it flat to figure out how big it really is, because people have no idea. And what they found was that it was equal, this little tiny structure in the back of the brain that's probably about this big, probably about that big, when the rest of the brain is like this, is 78% of the total surface area of the human neocortex. Holy crap, this is like a major breakthrough, okay? So it's essentially like a very flat sheet, and the author said it's about the thickness of a crepe you eat like a pancake, that is crinkled into hundreds upon hundreds of folds that make it able to be compact and to fit in this little 1/8 of the volume of the cerebral cortex, little spot, okay? Before they used to think, again, remember the theme here is they're dismissing the cerebellum. They're not letting the cerebellum shine like it wants to shine, right? They're underestimating it. So now they know when you fold out the cerebellum and you lay it completely flat, it's only about 4 inches wide, but it is almost 3 feet long. This information thrilled me to no end. Like, that validates how important the cerebellum is, you guys. And to me, more important than that, it validates all of you that live with cerebellar issues, like what a mega impact that it's going to have on your life. It's all too often, oh, cerebellum, like it's balance. Oh, no respect or validation for the fact that it is definitely more than that. It is cognitive and it is emotional, okay? So here's what's super cool. So then they did this to monkeys, and they looked at monkeys and they didn't find the same thing. It's only 33% the size of the actual neocortex, the brain. So what this means is that the cerebellum has evolved between monkeys and humans for distinctive human behaviors and cognition, okay? So that is a very important missing piece in the brain puzzle that neuroscientists are always trying to figure out, okay? They also found this, which is very new information. So in the brain, there's something called the homunculus, or the little man, which it could also be called the little woman, but it's basically the somatosensory map of our body and how it is represented in our brain. And it is topographically correct. So it means like your mouth and your lips and your arm and your trunk and your legs, it's like a perfect human. It's not proportional because the lips are very overrepresented. Your thumbs are the most overrepresented. That's why I think it hurts so bad if you get like a hangnail or something. It's like, oh, your thumb is so overrepresented in your head, but it's organized. And here's what they found about the cerebellum and how the cerebellum is different. Cerebellum is a little bit wild and woolly. It's not very orderly in terms of topographic map of our body. So what the author said was, you get a little chunk of lip on the left, you get a little chunk of the shoulder next to it, you get a little face. It's like a jumbled puzzle piece. And these parts of the cerebellum, their job then is to integrate or coordinate all the different pieces and to help you have a perception of your body as a whole entity, right? But what is so important about this, you guys, is this doesn't follow the logic idea of brain science. And so I know some of you will go in with a cerebellar stroke and you'll say like, I don't know why, but like I'm numb on my bottom lip. And the doctors are gonna be like, that can't be because the map of the body on the brain is actually in a part where you didn't have your stroke. Well, this completely validates that you're correct, okay? So I would say any weird motor symptom that you have from a cerebellar injury that has not been able to be figured out, this is pretty reassuring that you're not crazy, you're not making it up. The cerebellum in terms of motor map is totally different than we ever thought that it was before, okay? So to me, what all of this information means is that it's really up to you to pursue education and validation for your brain health challenge. This really revved me up because it really brought me back to the reason that we started doing this 3 years ago, which was to communicate in what I consider to be a more respectful way to the brain health community, saying, you should know this recent research as well as I know it. You're the one living with this thing, and really trying to underscore this idea that we need to be working in partnership with our doctors and our mental health providers to have this information be understood, okay? So if you have an emotional or a behavior symptom, cognitive symptom, after a cerebellar issue, please pursue a neuropsychological evaluation. That's how you're really going to understand what's happened to you, okay? I know this one was long tonight. You guys are so sweet to hang in there with me. I hope it felt like it was worth your time. We are halfway through the virtual stroke recovery group. We meet every Thursday night. Tomorrow night at 4 o'clock, we're doing like a 90-minute presentation on the importance of sleep after someone has had a stroke, and there are spots left. So if that is you, please come join us at our website, icfyb.com/SRG. I know that's a lot of letters, so Carrie will be nice enough to post that link in the comments once I am done talking. For next week, I don't have a topic. And when I don't have a topic, what I like to do is ask you to tell me the topic. So why don't you write me in the comment section below or private message me here on Facebook and tell me what to do. I need some direction, okay? I'm starting to really think a lot about Alzheimer's disease. That has been on my mind lately, and so I'm kind of thinking of maybe going a little bit in that direction in the next couple lectures. But what I care about is what you care about. So anything that is important to you, you just tell me, and I'll do my very best. Thank you guys so much for being here with me. It's a true pleasure, and if you can share this video with any groups that you belong to, what matters most to us is just getting this information out there to help people in their brain health journey. People should not be so alone. Take care, you guys, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.